Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path, and a light unto my path. You're the light unto my path.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the In the Word Bible Study. I believe this is episode number 9, if you're keeping up with the numbers. And we are glad that you're joining us. This is from the Bartlett Woods Church of Christ. And we are looking in depth at different scriptures to see how they can apply to our lives. Joining me here as our regular group for these few sessions that we've had, counterclockwise order on your screen, I believe, clockwise order is Adam and Steve and Jacob and Drew. I forgot my directions. And we are continuing our look at Romans chapter 12, which we've been looking at for these past few episodes. And it has some practical applications of how we can live our lives as Christians while we are out in the world. So we are picking up this week with Romans chapter 12, verse 17. And once again, Jacob is going to start off telling us about that verse. So Jacob, take it away.
Yeah, sure. So Romans chapter 12, verse 17 says, "Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all." When I first thought about the first part of this verse, I don't know why, but my mind went back to middle school gym class. I think it was, I think I thought of back in the locker room, you had these two middle school boys who were bowed up, they were ready to start swinging because they were either saying like, my dad could beat up your dad or whatever it is, whatever middle school, boys argue about or fight about. But, just that attitude of, don't mess with me or I'm going to mess with you, or don't mess with me or I'm going to get back at you. And, that's kind of maybe funny to think about for middle school, but, I'm 30 years old and sometimes I can have the same mindset. I think all of us maybe at times have this feeling, this desire, maybe this anger within us that when somebody does wrong to us, we want to see them get what's coming, or we want to pay them back for the evil or the wrong that they've done us. And it could be something relatively, I guess, minor from day to day. I guess you could think about it that way. But in a very real sense, in today's world, there's a lot of very serious evil in this world. There's people that are experiencing on a daily basis either verbal or physical abuse, or there's some that have unfortunately lost loved ones at the hands of others who've been killed, or there's lots of evil in this world today. And yet Paul says, repay no one evil for evil. And I just think about how hard that is sometimes, because we do want to get back. And I won't go too far into just a couple of verses down in somebody else's verse 19, but there is a chance that we give that back to God, right? But but Paul encourages the people, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. And so when you're faced with those difficult situations, when you're faced with those evils, Paul is saying that as a Christian, our response is different than that of the world. Our response is in line with what Christ taught. If you look back in the book of Matthew, Christ taught about being struck on one cheek and turning the other cheek. And just a few verses prior to this in Romans, we just talked about how you are to love your enemies. And we talked about how you can pray for your enemies. And the response that we have makes a difference as Christians. And that's what Paul, I think, is encouraging here. And then also, as we continue on in this verse, doing giving thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. I like that he uses the word to give thought, because sometimes I think in that moment when we are wanting to repay evil, we don't give thought to it. It's just a gut reaction. It's just, I want to get back to this person and let the anger overcome me. And he says, give thought to do what is honorable. And, take a minute, let's step back, let's think about it. I also ran across Proverbs chapter 15, verse 33, where it says, the fear of the Lord is instruction and wisdom, and humility comes before honor. So if we are wanting to do what is honorable in the sight of all, I think we have to first think of that word humility for ourselves. We have to understand what humility is. And if pride is what's driving that evil response, then humility is what's going to drive that honorable response. And so those are some of the things I thought about as I was looking at this verse.
Excellent thoughts. Any follow-up for what Jacob had to say? If not, we'll move on. And I have the next verse, which is verse 18. And I saved my comments because it kind of follows up on what Jacob was just talking about. Romans chapter 12, verse 18 says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And what this makes me think of is not necessarily middle school, but raising a child up through the ages, through middle school and all the way back. And a lesson that we've gone over several times with him when he would come to us and say, well, this person didn't do what I wanted them to, or they did what I didn't want them to do, or why don't they do this, whatever. And the lesson that we teach over and over again is the only person you can control is yourself. You can set examples, you can say what you think should be done, but really it comes down to you. The only person you can control is yourself. And this verse always reminds me of that, because here Paul is saying, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. You can't control everyone else, but you can do your part to live at peace with others. And that goes back to what Jacob was just talking about not repaying evil for evil, but thinking about doing what is honorable as much as it depends on you. Show that honor to other people. And that goes back to other verses in Romans chapter 12 as well, verse 3, where it says, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think with sober judgment. We talked last week about the verse that says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. That's what we just read. The verse right before that was, never be wise in your own sight. And so here again, it's saying, don't think you're so great. Don't think you're so much better than everyone else, but do what you can to live at peace with others. I'm reminded of what Jesus said in John 14:27, where he talks about giving us peace. He says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Jesus gives us this peace, and it is up to us to do what we can to share it with others. It's not always going to be easy. Jesus later on in the same speech, more or less, that he was giving, John chapter 16, verse 33, he said, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So peace is not always going to be easy, but it is up to us to do all that we can, as much as it depends on us, to live peaceably with all. And so that's a challenge in today's world, when everyone wants to get justice and demand that justice be done, and wants everything to be right. And we can't control what everyone else does, but we can set an example by the way that we live and by the peace that we show to other people. So it's a short verse, but it is one that to me is very meaningful, because it reminds me that the responsibility is on me to do my part, to do what I can. Any follow-up comments to that? All right, then moving on. We're saving all our comments till the end this time. Moving on, we have Drew next, and Drew is going to talk to us about two verses, because they go together, verses 19 and 20. Drew?
All right, so Romans 12, verses 19 and 20. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the Lord. sorry. But leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. So these two verses are taken. So the verse 19 is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 35, and then chapter 20 or verse 20 is taken from Proverbs 25 verses 21 or 21 and 22. And these are verses that you hear quoted a lot. It's one of these verses that that you hear people pull out for whenever they want to use it, kind of things. But there's some good points in here. So for verse 19, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. It's not just talking about avenging or revenge outwardly, physically. But I think, it applies internally, in your heart. This is not just something that's going to say, okay, well, so-and-so did this to me, so I'm going to turn around and do it to them. But, that shouldn't, you've got to make sure that doesn't even come into your heart. That doesn't even cross your mind. In verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. Thirsty, give him something to drink. By doing so, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Obviously this isn't literal, but it's also, in studying this, there's some, not controversy, but people think of it different ways. But, to me, the burning coals is kind of that, it's kind of that person's conscience, that burning conscience is just going to, that they did something to you, maybe wronged you some way, but you turn around and do something good for them. That's going to be in their mind of, why is that? I did this to them. I wronged them, and they turned around and they helped me. That's really gonna put them on the spot with themselves. Nobody else may know about it. Nobody else may know that they wronged you or that you did something good for them, but they know it. That's something that they're going to think about. To me, these verses really, more than anything, come down to Luke 6. I'm going to read. I'll try to go quick. Luke 6, starting at verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. That's what this boils down to. Kind of comes back to the golden rule. As you wish others to do to you, do so to them. Just because they wronged you doesn't mean that you should turn around and do the same back to them. The perfect example, in Luke 23, verse 34, and Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Here he is hanging there on the cross. He's been betrayed by, one of his disciples. And, here he is asking for forgiveness for these people. That's a perfect example. We should look at ourselves and overcome that urge for the revenge, to avenge evil. That's left to God. It's mentioned several times throughout the Bible, but that's kind of what this verse boils down to me. If you think about it, just kind of boils down to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Excellent thoughts. Anyone have anything to add to that? Any stories to share? I've got a story to share that my grandmother used to tell about a time that her neighbor was mad at her for something. Some don't even know why, but the neighbor lady was mad at my grandmother. So my grandmother baked her a pie. And while she was baking it, she was saying, I'm going to heap burning coals on her head. So she took her the pie and just said, bake to this pie, went back home. And so then the neighbor lady came back and was apologizing for being mad at her and said, really no reason to be mad at all, whatever. So it works. I mean, if you do something as simple as baking a pie for someone, doing something kind for someone, it does, like Drew talked about, it does play on their conscience and makes them think about why they are angry with you or whatever is going on with you. So give it a try. Bake your neighbor a pie sometime. And with that, we will go to Adam and verse 21, the last verse of the chapter. Save the best for last. So Adam, tell us about verse 21.
All right. So Romans 12 and verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I think that as we read through all of this chapter 12 and all the things we've been looking at, I think a couple of things are important to bear in mind. I think number one, we have to realize that Paul is talking to the Romans, who are a group of Gentile Christians living amongst heathens, if you will, and are being extremely persecuted by their government. And if we go back to the beginning of chapter 12, Paul opens chapter 12 and he says, I urge you, brethren, by mercies, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable unto God. This is your spiritual act of worship. And then he goes on and he says, do not be conformed by the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may then prove that the will of God is that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And then he goes through all the things we've talked about, and he closes this section with, don't allow evil, or do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so keeping in mind that Paul's talking to Gentile Christians who are being persecuted, and he's just told them, he said that you have to totally transform your mind in order to see the good of God. And then he lays out all the characteristics and things that we are to do, and then he closes out and he says, you can't allow evil to overcome you. And the only way to do that is to overcome that evil with the good that is within yourself. Jesus, and I think Steve, you talked about this earlier, as Jesus' ministry is coming to an end and he's talking to his disciples in John, and the scene is they're sitting around the table at the Last Supper, and Jesus is really kind of charging them and really kind of setting them up and saying, hey, the end for me is coming, but this is just the beginning for you. And he says in John 15, he tells them that, you know what, the world's going to hate you. They hate you because you love me. And so you have to be prepared now that the world is not going to like you. In fact, they're going to hate you. And if we as Christians, we have to be very careful, because hatred breeds hatred, which then breeds more hatred, which then breeds more hatred. And if we allow hatred to come within us and become a part of us, then we cannot do what Paul here is saying, and overcoming evil with good, because we've allowed that hatred to come in and be a part of who we are. Turn very quickly over to Ephesians chapter 4. And here Paul is writing to the church in Ephesus, and very similar scenario, again, writing to Gentiles who were being who are being persecuted for their faith. And beginning in verse 17, and I'm not going to read 17 for time, but Paul lays out here for the Christians, and he says, you were once living a life as a Gentile lived. Now you're charged to live a life as Christians lived. And in verse 19 of Ephesians 4, Paul says, he says, having become calloused and having given yourself over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. You see, if we don't focus on Christ and we don't, keep that mindset top of mind, we're going to become calloused, and we're going to become to the point to where that our reflex is no longer good, but our reflex is going to be hatred and be evil. Continuing on in Ephesians 4, beginning of verse 25, Paul says, therefore, lay aside all falsehood and speak truth, each one of you, to his neighbor, for we are members one to another. He says, be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Do not give the devil an opportunity. He who steals must steal no longer. He who labors, he must perform with his hands that is good, so that something to share with the one who is in need. And so Paul here, he's challenging the church in Ephesus, and he's saying, look, it's hard. It's not easy, but you've got to protect yourself, because if you don't, you're going to give the devil a foothold. And when he gets a foothold, then he's going to overcome you. And then you're not going to be able to overcome that evil with good. And I'm going to close with the passage out of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul here is talking to the church in Corinth, and he says, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. And so we've talked all throughout this series about all the things that we should be doing. And at the end of the day, we are ambassadors for Christ. That when people see us, they should see Christ. That when we speak, we should be speaking Christ. That we are ambassadors for Christ. And our actions reflect our God. Whether that's evil or whether that's good. Our actions reflect our God. So, we're told to overcome evil with good. And if we don't do that, then we're having a massive negative impact on God's kingdom. But if we do overcome evil with good, and we do all the things we've talked about tonight, then that impact that we have on the world could literally change society and could literally change the world. And so, Drew, you talked about, that it all comes down to, the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself. And it really does. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And Jesus tells us, he says, basically the number one rule is to love him with every part of who you are. And the second is just like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so our actions reflect our God. And so we have to do our best to not give the devil a foothold, but to overcome that evil with good.
Great thoughts. And I want to follow up on that just a little bit with, if you're wondering how do you overcome evil with good, well, that's what we've just been talking about being kind to others, about heaping burning coals on their head, doing something out of kindness even if someone doesn't deserve it, living at peace with others, not repaying evil for evil, and so on. All these things that we've talked about, this verse really sums up a whole lot of these thoughts that we've been having about here's the main point behind it is overcome evil with good. And so that's a good way to sum up what we've been talking about so far. Anybody else have any thoughts they want to add?
Yeah, I found it interesting, there was kind of a similar theme among all the verses that we read tonight. And obviously there kind of has been, leading up to it as well. But I think it's interesting if if you know what's coming in the next chapter when it talks about being in submission to the authorities. You look at a verse like chapter 13. Let's see. In verse 4, where it says, "For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." And so, I don't know, I just kind of think it's interesting that he could have led with this. He could have led with, look, there's a way that God is going to take care of the evildoer. But what he starts with is in this chapter 12 is, our focus should be first on what do we do as Christians? What is our response? So he starts with, we need to work on us, and then God will take care of the evildoer. But he doesn't start with, you need to be worried about the evildoer. No, he says, our focus should be what our response is first. So I just kind of thought that was interesting as we were going into the next chapter there.
That's a very good point. And it's important to keep in mind that when Paul wrote this, he didn't break it up into chapters like we have it now. It was just all one continuous thought too. So I would encourage you to read the whole book of Romans. Don't just focus on chapter 12 as we've been doing. You could do an in-depth study of the whole book, which has been done before, and it's very interesting and encouraging for us as Christians. So I would encourage you to read the following chapters and see what comes next on how to live your life as a Christian. Anything else as we close? We have one more session with this panel, so next time we're going to take a bigger picture view perhaps and sum up Romans chapter 12 even more and to get some overall views of it. And so we hope you will join us for that again. Hope you can join us at Bartlett Wood sometimes. We'd love to see you there. And we thank you for joining us tonight.